3 weeks before my wedding, I found out the venue had never actually been booked under my name. It was booked under someone else's. That someone else was my fiancé's ex-girlfriend, and by the time I understood what was actually happening, I realized I hadn't been planning my wedding for the past 2 years. I had been planning hers. My name is Kayla, and this is the story of the most elaborate deception I've ever lived through. One that took 2 years to build and 3 weeks to completely unravel, and one I only survived because of a single accidental phone call that was never supposed to reach me at all. I met Ethan 4 years ago at a mutual friend's barbecue, in the kind of easy, low-stakes way most relationships start before anyone involved has any idea how far things will eventually go. He was funny, attentive, the kind of guy who remembered small details from conversations weeks later, and for the first year and a half of our relationship, everything about us felt, to me, uncomplicated in the best possible way. We moved in together after a year. He proposed after 2.5 years, at the same restaurant where we'd had our first date, and I said yes without a single moment of hesitation, genuinely believing I understood the shape of the life I was building with him. I want to explain, before I get into how this all fell apart, that Ethan's family had always struck me as slightly unusual, though for most of our relationship, I attributed that to ordinary family dynamics rather than anything more concerning. His mother, Patricia, was intensely involved in every aspect of Ethan's life, in a way that occasionally grated on me, but never seemed sinister. Just an overly close mother-son relationship, the kind plenty of people navigate without it meaning anything deeper was wrong. What I didn't fully understand, until 3 weeks before my wedding, was that Patricia had never accepted Ethan's breakup with his previous girlfriend, a woman named Sabrina, whom he dated for nearly 4 years before we met, and who Patricia had, according to what I eventually pieced together, considered practically a daughter during that relationship. Ethan had told me, early in our relationship, a simple, unremarkable story about Sabrina, that they'd grown apart, that the relationship had run its course, that they'd broken up amicably about 6 months before he and I met. I had no reason to question this story. I met Sabrina exactly once, briefly, at a mutual friend's holiday party about a year into my relationship with Ethan, and the interaction was polite, unremarkable, nothing that raised any flags at the time. What I didn't know, what I wouldn't learn until 3 weeks before my own wedding, was that Patricia had spent the years since that breakup quietly, persistently working to reverse it, convinced, in a way that had apparently calcified into something closer to obsession, that Sabrina was the only appropriate partner for her son, and that Ethan's relationship with me was a temporary detour rather than a genuine, permanent choice. The wedding planning process, in hindsight, contained warning signs I dismissed at the time as simply Patricia being overbearing, the same explanation I'd applied to her behavior throughout our entire relationship. She insisted on being heavily involved in vendor selection, using connections from the wedding she'd helped plan years ago that turned out, I would later learn, to be vague references to an entire parallel wedding she'd apparently been planning with Sabrina in mind since before Ethan and I were even engaged. She pushed hard for a specific venue, a beautiful vineyard property about 90 minutes outside the city, insisting she had a special relationship with the owners that would guarantee us better treatment and pricing. She recommended a florist, a caterer, and a photographer, all of whom, she assured me, she'd worked with extensively and trusted completely. I found her involvement occasionally exhausting, occasionally overstepping boundaries I would have preferred she respect, but never once did I suspect the truth, that every single vendor she recommended already had years of established relationship with an entirely different bride, one whose wedding Patricia had never actually stopped planning, even while attending mine. The first genuine crack in this elaborate structure appeared 3 weeks before my wedding date, on an ordinary Tuesday evening, when my phone rang with a call from the Vineyard Venue's event coordinator, a woman named Michelle whom I'd worked with directly for over a year at that point, confirming logistics, discussing timeline details, building what I believed was a completely normal, professional relationship around my own wedding. "Hi Kayla, I'm so sorry. I think I've made an error on my end," Michelle said, her voice slightly rushed, apologetic. "I was updating the file for the Whitfield wedding, and I think I might have accidentally sent you their vendor timeline instead of yours. Can you check your email and let me know if that's what you received?" I opened the email she'd sent moments earlier. It contained a full, detailed wedding timeline, vendor arrival times, photography schedule, catering setup, for a wedding scheduled for the exact same date as mine, at the exact same venue, under the name Whitfield Marsh Wedding. Marsh was Ethan's last name. I sat with my phone in my hand for what felt like several minutes, staring at that document, trying to construct some innocent explanation for why a wedding under Ethan's family name, scheduled for my wedding date at my wedding venue, existed in this coordinator's files at all. I called Michelle back immediately. I'm sorry, can you explain what the Whitfield Marsh wedding actually is? I don't understand why this exists. There was a pause on her end that told me, before she even fully answered, that something significant was about to unravel. I, I'm so sorry. I think there might be some kind of mix-up on our end that I need to look into more carefully. Let me call you back within the hour. I want to make sure I give you accurate information rather than guessing. That hour was one of the longest of my entire life. When Michelle called back, her voice carried the careful, slightly panicked tone of someone who had just discovered she was in the middle of something far more complicated than a simple scheduling error. What she explained, piece by piece, was almost impossible for me to process even as she was actively telling me. The venue had, in fact, been booked under two separate reservation files for the exact same date. Mine, under Ethan and Kayla Marsh, and a second one, created roughly 18 months earlier, under the name Ethan and Sabrina Whitfield, with deposits paid, vendor coordination underway, and, most disorienting of all, a signature on the original booking contract that, according to Michelle, matched Ethan's handwriting. I want to try to describe the specific vertigo of learning that your fiancé's ex-girlfriend's wedding, to your own fiancé, had been in active planning for 18 months, running in complete parallel to your own engagement, using many of the exact same vendors your future mother-in-law had personally recommended to you. It felt less like discovering an affair, and more like discovering that the entire structure of my engagement had been, in some fundamental way, a kind of elaborate placeholder, real enough, from my perspective, but apparently understood by at least two other people, Ethan and his mother, as something temporary, something that existed alongside a different, ongoing plan they both still believed would eventually take precedence. I called Ethan immediately after hanging up with Michelle, my hands shaking so badly I had to try dialing twice. He didn't answer. I called 4 more times over the following hour, each call going straight to voicemail, before he finally called back, his voice carrying a strange, tight quality I'd never heard from him before. Kayla, hey, sorry, I was in a meeting. What's up? Who is Sabrina Whitfield, and why does she have a wedding booked at our venue, on our date, under your name? The silence on the other end of that call stretched long enough that I genuinely wondered if the connection had dropped. When he finally spoke, his voice had lost its earlier casualness entirely. Kayla, I can explain this. Can we talk in person? This isn't something I want to get into over the phone. You'll explain it right now, Ethan, or I'm calling off the wedding tonight. I drove to his office that same evening, refusing to wait even the short additional time it would have taken him to come to me. I remember sitting in the parking lot of his building for nearly 15 minutes before going in, trying to steady my breathing enough to walk through the doors without falling apart entirely. When he finally came down to meet me, in a small, empty conference room his coworkers had clearly vacated for privacy, he looked, for the first time since I'd known him, genuinely afraid. Not of losing me, I would come to understand over the following hours, but of finally having to say out loud something he'd apparently been avoiding confronting for the better part of 2 years. What followed was one of the most disorienting conversations of my entire life, delivered in fragments over nearly 2 hours, as Ethan slowly, reluctantly revealed a truth that had apparently been operating underneath our entire engagement without my knowledge. Roughly 8 months before Ethan proposed to me, his mother Patricia had reconnected him with Sabrina, initially framed as simply re-establishing a friendly connection after their breakup. According to Ethan, this reconnection had, without his fully processing or acknowledging it to himself, evolved into an ongoing, secretive relationship that existed alongside his relationship with me. Not a full affair in the traditional sense, he insisted, though the distinction felt meaningless to me in that moment, but a continued emotional and eventually romantic connection that his mother had actively facilitated and encouraged, believing Sabrina was still the more appropriate match for her son. Patricia, it turned out, had never stopped planning a wedding for Ethan and Sabrina. Treating my entire 2.5-year relationship with Ethan as a temporary detour she fully expected would eventually resolve itself, allowing the real wedding, the one she'd been building toward with Sabrina for years, to finally happen. When Ethan proposed to me, rather than fully committing to that decision, he had apparently continued a secret, parallel relationship with Sabrina, one his mother actively supported and helped conceal, going so far as to help coordinate a second, entirely separate wedding, using her own connections and reputation with local vendors to build an elaborate, ongoing plan that existed in complete secrecy alongside the wedding I believed was the only one happening. I didn't know how to stop it. Ethan said, his voice thick with what sounded like genuine distress, though I found myself unable to fully trust anything about his emotional state by that point. Every time I tried to end things with Sabrina, my mom would talk me back into it. She kept saying I was making a mistake with you, that Sabrina and I were meant to be together, and somewhere along the way, I just let both things keep happening because I didn't know how to face either of you with the truth. I want to be clear about something I've had to sit with extensively in the time since this happened. I don't believe Ethan set out, from the very beginning of our relationship, to deceive me on this scale. I think, based on everything that came out over the following weeks, that he was a genuinely conflicted person who lacked the courage to make a clear decision, and who allowed his mother's persistent, manipulative influence to push him into maintaining two relationships simultaneously rather than honestly choosing between them. This understanding doesn't excuse what happened. It simply helps me make sense of how something this elaborate could exist for as long as it did without Ethan, in his own telling, ever fully consciously deciding to build it. I ended the engagement that same night, over the phone, unable to physically be in the same room as him without feeling a kind of visceral, full-body revulsion at everything I'd just learned. I called Michelle back the following morning and formally canceled our venue reservation, learning, in that conversation, an additional detail that somehow made everything worse. Patricia had been the primary point of contact on several vendor accounts throughout the entire process, meaning that even vendors I believed I'd built genuine, independent relationships with over the preceding year had, in some cases, been coordinating logistics with both weddings simultaneously, treating the overlap as some kind of ordinary scheduling complexity rather than the profound deception it actually represented. The 3 weeks that followed my broken engagement were some of the most surreal of my entire life. I had to cancel a wedding that, as far as nearly everyone in my life knew, was still fully proceeding as planned. I had to call my own parents, who had already booked flights and hotel rooms, and explain, through tears I couldn't fully control, that the wedding they'd been looking forward to for 2 years wasn't happening, and why. I had to face my bridesmaids, several of whom had already purchased dresses, already blocked off vacation time, already invested significant money and emotional energy into a day that had, unbeknownst to any of us, existed in direct competition with an entirely separate, secret wedding the entire time. What made everything even more disorienting was learning, through a mutual friend about 2 weeks after everything fell apart, that Sabrina herself had apparently believed, throughout this entire 2-year period, that she and Ethan were the primary, committed relationship, and that his relationship with me was the secondary, temporary arrangement rather than the other way around. She had, according to this friend, been under the impression that Ethan intended to eventually break off his engagement to me and formally commit to her, an expectation Patricia had apparently reinforced consistently throughout the entire 2 years, telling Sabrina, repeatedly, that Ethan's engagement to me was just something he needs to get out of his system before returning to the relationship Patricia had always considered the correct one. I never spoke to Sabrina directly, though I've thought about her often in the time since. In much the same complicated way I imagine other people in similarly tangled deceptions think about the other party they were never supposed to know existed. We were both, in different ways, being managed by the same 2 people, each of us believing we held the primary position in Ethan's life, neither of us fully aware that the other's version of that same belief was being actively, deliberately sustained at the exact same time. I confronted Patricia exactly once, about a month after everything fully came apart, in a conversation I initiated mostly because I needed some form of closure, some direct acknowledgement from the person who had, in many ways, orchestrated the entire deception more actively than Ethan himself had. She didn't apologize. I want to be honest about that, because I think it matters to understanding the full shape of what happened. Instead, she offered a kind of chilling, matter-of-fact justification. "I always knew you weren't right for him," she told me, her voice carrying none of the warmth she'd shown throughout our 2 years of wedding planning together. "Sabrina understands our family in a way you never did. I did what I thought was best for my son, and I'm not going to apologize for that, even if the timing turned out to be difficult for you." I remember standing in her kitchen, the same kitchen where we'd sat together countless times over 2 years, choosing centerpiece designs and discussing seating charts, and feeling something in me finally, fully understand that this woman had never once, throughout the entire engagement, viewed me as a genuine, permanent addition to her family. I had been, from her perspective, an obstacle to manage, a temporary complication in a plan she'd never actually abandoned, however convincingly she'd performed enthusiasm for my wedding throughout 2 years of careful, detailed planning. The vendors, once the full situation became clear, were almost uniformly horrified to learn the extent of what had been happening without their knowledge. Michelle, the venue coordinator who had made that first accidental call, later told me she'd had no idea the 2 bookings were connected to the same groom. Patricia had apparently used slightly different contact information and payment methods for each reservation. Enough of a distinction that the overlap hadn't been obvious until the scheduling software flagged a date conflict that finally forced the issue into the open. Several other vendors reached out to me directly in the weeks that followed, apologetic and clearly uncomfortable with having unknowingly participated, even peripherally, in what had become a genuinely devastating situation for me. I want to describe what the actual day of my originally scheduled wedding felt like, because I think it's one of the more surreal experiences I've ever lived through. I didn't attend a wedding that day. Obviously, mine had been canceled weeks earlier. But I later learned, through the same mutual friend who'd first told me about Sabrina's expectations, that Ethan and Sabrina had, in fact, gotten married on that exact date. At a different, smaller venue Patricia had apparently arranged as a backup once the original vineyard booking became impossible to untangle. My wedding date became their wedding date, a detail that struck me, when I first learned it, as almost too cruel to be real, though by that point in the story, very little about the entire situation still had the capacity to genuinely surprise me. I spent that particular day, the day that was supposed to be my wedding, at my sister's house, surrounded by the small group of people who had actually shown up for me throughout the entire unraveling. My parents, my sister, my two closest friends, none of whom needed any further explanation for why I didn't want to be alone on a date that would have otherwise marked the beginning of a marriage built on a foundation I now understood had never been solid at all. We ordered takeout from the restaurant where Ethan had originally proposed to me, a strange, almost defiant decision I made on purpose, wanting to reclaim at least one small piece of the story for myself rather than letting it remain entirely tangled up in what had happened. My sister made a toast that evening, half joking, half serious, to the wedding that didn't happen and the marriage we all just dodged. And for the first time since Michelle's phone call 3 weeks earlier, I actually laughed, a real laugh. The first genuine crack of relief inside weeks of grief and disorientation. It's been just over a year since everything happened. I've moved to a new apartment in a different part of the city, deliberately putting physical distance between myself and the version of my life that included Ethan, Patricia, and the elaborate, secret architecture I spent 2 years unknowingly existing alongside. I've started therapy, specifically to process not just the betrayal itself, but the deeper, more unsettling question it raised for me. How completely I had trusted my own judgment about a person and a family, only to learn, in the most devastating way possible, how little I had actually understood about what was happening underneath the surface of our entire relationship. My therapist has helped me understand something I didn't fully grasp in the immediate aftermath, that the specific shame I felt, in those first few months, for not having noticed sooner, wasn't really mine to carry. Deception built this carefully, over 2 full years, by 2 people working in coordination, isn't something a reasonable, trusting partner should be expected to detect through instinct alone. I've had to actively unlearn the instinct to blame myself for trusting someone who had, apparently from very early in our engagement, already decided I was the temporary option rather than the permanent one. I don't know how Ethan and Sabrina's marriage is going, and I've made a deliberate choice not to seek that information out, understanding that whatever peace I'm building for myself doesn't benefit from continued awareness of the life that was built, quite literally, on the ruins of the one I thought I was building. I do know, through the same persistent grapevine of mutual friends that seems to follow every messy breakup, that Patricia has fully embraced her role as Sabrina's mother-in-law with the same intense, controlling enthusiasm she once directed toward our wedding planning, a detail that, when I heard it, produced a complicated mixture of vindication and a kind of exhausted, retrospective clarity about exactly what I'd actually been dealing with throughout those 2 years, without ever fully understanding it. I think, most often, about that single accidental phone call from Michelle, the specific, narrow window of chance that meant I found out the truth 3 weeks before my wedding instead of, potentially, not at all, or worse, on the day itself, standing at an altar, waiting for a groom who might have never actually planned to fully choose me at all. I don't know what would have happened if that scheduling software hadn't flagged the conflict, if Michelle hadn't made that specific error, if I hadn't happened to be available to answer my phone during the exact hour she called back with the full explanation. I try not to spend too much time on that particular thought experiment, because I think it risks pulling me back into a kind of paralyzing, retrospective fear that doesn't actually serve my healing. What I focus on instead, most days, is the simple, if painful, fact that I did find out, in time, before I made permanent legal and emotional commitments to a relationship that was never as solid as I believed it to be. That, I've come to understand, is its own kind of fortune, even wrapped inside the specific, devastating grief of losing an engagement I'd spent 2 years building my entire future around. My mother, in the weeks after everything fell apart, said something to me I still return to often, sitting with me at her kitchen table while I struggled to make sense of how thoroughly I'd been deceived. "You didn't waste 2 years, Kayla," she told me. "You learned 2 years worth of truth about people who were never going to be honest with you eventually anyway. Better now than after a marriage license made untangling it 100 times harder." I didn't fully believe her in that moment, still too raw from the specific humiliation of realizing how much of my life had been quietly happening alongside someone else's. I believe her more now, a year removed from the worst of it, with enough distance to see the shape of what I actually avoided rather than only what I lost. I've started, slowly, to trust my own judgment again, though it's a more careful, deliberate kind of trust than the version I had before all of this happened. I find myself paying closer attention now to the small inconsistencies I might have once dismissed as nothing. A vague answer here, an oddly specific excuse there, not out of paranoia, but out of a hard-earned understanding that sometimes those small inconsistencies are the only visible edge of something much larger hiding underneath. If you've ever discovered that a relationship you trusted completely was quietly running in parallel to something else you had no idea existed, I want to hear how you found out and how you found your way through it afterward. I used to believe that 2 years of consistent, detailed effort, the kind that goes into planning an entire wedding, was proof enough of someone's genuine commitment. I've learned, in the hardest possible way, that effort and honesty aren't always the same thing, and that sometimes the people who seem the most invested in building a life with you are simultaneously building an entirely different one, right alongside it, hoping you never happen to receive the one phone call that reveals which version of the story was actually true.